Welcome to a new series on intellectual history of Ashʿarism, one of the most influential theological traditions in Sunni Islam. And in this first segment, we journey back to the formative centuries of Islamic theology, where we explore the period when debates on divine attributes, free will, revelation, and reason were shaping the trajectory of Sunni kalām. And today we begin with Ibn Kullāb, a foundational yet often misunderstood theologian whose ideas laid important groundwork for the later Ashari thought. Although few of his writings survive, medieval sources and modern scholarship allow us to reconstruct his distinct contribution, his defense of traditionalist doctrine through rational arguments, his nuanced approach to divine speech, and his bold engagement with the Mu'tazilite at a critical moment in the Islamic intellectual history. And here we situate Ibn Kullāb within the broader landscape of the early Kalam, where we highlight his methods, debates, and doctrinal formulation that will deeply influence the subsequent Sunni theologians. So let's begin our discussion of the Proto-Ashari movement and the minds who prepared the way. So before the rise of Ashʿarism in the 9th century as the leading Sunni theological school which engaged in Kalam or the dialectical theology, several theologians, most notably Ibn Kullāb, al-Muḥasibi, and al-Qalānisi, made determined efforts to defend the traditionalist doctrine through reasoned argumentation. Although firmly rooted in Sunni traditionalist belief, these scholars used Kalam tools to articulate doctrines that oppose the more radical monotheism asserted by Mu'tazila. As proponent of the eternal divine attributes known as the Sifatiyya at Ahlul Ithbat, they shared the key tenets with the Ashab al-Hadith, especially concerning the eternality of God's attributes and the rejection of Mu'tazili negationism. Yet, in a manner similar to their intellectual heirs, the Ashʿarites, their attempts to develop a systemic and rational Sunni theology brought them into the direct conflict with the strict Hanabalites. Many humble scholars view the use of the Kalam as an unwarranted innovation of the bid'ah that compromised the simplicity and the purity of the early Islamic doctrine. And one of the most controversial issues of the time was Mu'tazilite doctrine of the created Quran, or the Khalqul Quran. And during the Mihna instigated by the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century, this doctrine was enforced as a state dogma. And since Mihna forms such a crucial backdrop to understanding this entire debate, it is worth noting briefly here that it's marked a period of intense religious inquisitions in which scholars were compelled to affirm the createdness of the Quran. We'll, however, explore the Mihna in far greater details in a separate dedicated series where its intellectual, political, and theological dimensions can be fully unpacked. A strong resistance not only from Ahl al-Hadith traditionalists but also from the several Kalam theologians even, among them the followers of Ibn Kullāb, who rejected the idea of a created Quran and affirmed that the divine speech of the Kalamullah is uncreated and eternal. And these theologians upheld the broader teaching of the Sifatiyya, the belief in the uncreated Quran, the affirmation of the God's eternal attributes, the acceptance of the divine predetermination or the qadr regarding human action and destiny. And later Sunni Kalami schools, especially the Ashāriyya, recognized the pioneering role of the scholars such as Ibn Kullāb, al-Muḥasibi, and al-Qalānisi. They referred to them respectfully as al-Mutakallimūna min as-Salaf, means that the early theologians among the pious predecessors are the ancient Sunni theologians. Their approach was seen as a bridge between the strict traditionalism and the more reasoned articulation of theology. Historical evidence suggests that Kullābite theologian Ḥabd al-Kullābiyya continued to coexist with the early Ashāris or the Ashārites until at least the late 10th century. The geographer and scholar al-Maqdisi notes that by this time Kullābite school had largely been absorbed into the Ashārite tradition. They had contributed significantly to Ashari formulation of doctrine. In later centuries, some humbly critiques, most importantly Ibn Taymiyyah, used the term Kullābiyya pejoratively. And for them is encompassed not only the followers of Ibn Kullāb, but more broadly all groups accused of mixing the authentic creed of the Sunni traditionalism with the elements of the Kalam and speculative reasoning. And this criticism reflects the long-standing tension between the rational theology and strict textual traditionalism in intellectual Islamic history. Although the pioneering effort of these early theologians profoundly shaped the later emergence of the Ashฏarism, it is important not to overlook the possibility that the influence extended into the other theological streams as well. Information about their lives and doctrines is preserved in a wide range of the medieval sources, Ashārites, Hanabalites, and Mu'tazilites, each offering its own perspective and biases. By the 11th century, however, their significance within Islamic theology had become primarily historical. They were remembered chiefly as the early pioneers who laid the foundation for Sunni kalām. None of works attributed to Ibn Kullāb or al-Kalam appear to have survived beyond this period. However, in contrast, many books by al-Muḥassab did endure and continue to be widely available today. Yet, most of his extant writings focus on ethics, spiritual discipline, and inner purification, core themes of the classical Sufism, rather than explicitly on theology, or at least they have been primarily interpreted through that lens. Over the past century, modern scholarship and other historians of Islamic thought has played a vital role in reconstructing the history of early Islamic theology. Their studies, based on the meticulous analysis of the medieval biographical, doctrinal, and hagiographical sources, have helped to clarify the doctrines and intellectual contribution of these early mutakallimun. This reconstruction has also been enriched by the research in the related fields of Islamic studies. Scholarship on the development of the Islamic jurisprudence of the fiqh, Sufism, and the rise of the Sunni traditionalism, or the Salafiyya Sunniya, provides insight into the broader social, intellectual, and political context in which the theological debates unfolded. And through this combined approach, we gain more comprehensive understanding of how early doctrinal positions emerged, evolved, and interacted within the diverse landscape of Islamic thought. The Basran Abū Muḥammad ibn Muḥammad became known as Ibn Kullāb, a nickname likely driven from Kullāb, which means the grappling hook, and perhaps alluding to his ability to intellectually overpower his opponents in the debates. His family name al-Qattan suggests an ancestral connection to the cotton trade, although no evidence indicates that he personally worked in that trade, and such a family background may have provided the financial stability needed for a scholarly life. Ibn Kullāb died in 855, only 2 years before the death of his associate al-Muḥassab, and most likely in his hometown Basra, though he appears to have spent part of his life in Baghdad as well. And one report states that he lost a theological debate with Muʿtazila at the court of the Caliph al-Ma'mun. However, another conflicting anecdote suggests that he refused to appear at the caliphal court altogether because of the al-Ma'mun's reputation for the moral laxity, an incident noted by some modern scholars. And broadly speaking, Ibn Kullāb's theological methods represents the application of the Basran kalām to the defense of the doctrines that were largely aligned with the Sunni traditionalist creed or the Aqidat al-Hadith. And it is difficult to determine with certainty which earlier theologians influenced him or with whom he formerly studied. However, he is frequently linked to an-Najjar, from whom he may have adopted the idea that human actions are created by the God but acquired or the muktasab by human agents, a concept that will later to be incorporated with modification into Ashʿari theology. Some of the Kullāb's formulation regarding the divine attributes resemble the views of the early Shiite theologians as well, such as Hisham ibn al-Hakam, Sulaiman ibn Jarir. Despite this, his theological project was firmly positioned against the dominance of the Mu'tazila during his time. A polemical treatise refuting Mu'tazila doctrine is attributed to him, along with the 2 additional works that appears to challenge the Mu'tazili positions. Number 1, Kitab al-Sifat and the divine attributes, and number 2, Kitab al-Ḥasan and God's creation of the human actions. He is also reported to have debated extensively with the Mu'tazilite scholar Ḥabbad ibn Sulaiman. Ḥabbad accused him of advancing a suspiciously Christian-like doctrine. He argued that Ibn Kullāb's assertion of the uncreated divine speech resembled the Christian notion of the Trinity. Within Mu'tazilite circles, stories circulated portraying Ibn Kullāb as a crypto-Christian attempting to undermine Islam from within. While such claims are polemical and historically unreliable, they illustrate the intense sectarian tension surrounding the theological debates in the early Abbasid period. Despite Ibn Kullāb's sharply negative portrayal in the later Mu'tazilite sources, it is striking that neither he nor associates with the similar theological leanings such as al-Muḥassab are reported to have suffered the persecution during the Mihna. Scholars suggest that Ibn Kullāb's prominence may have been largely posthumous and becoming influential only after his death, and consequently, he may not have been considered significant enough at the time to attract the attention of inquisitions. His attempt to blend the traditionalist doctrine with the methods of kalām appears to have appealed to only a limited circle during his lifetime and gained momentum only among the next generation of theologians. So the period following the Mihna and the reversal of Abbasid religious policy under the Caliph al-Mutawakkil has often been described as reactionary and supposedly hostile to this speculative reasoning. However, recent scholarship challenged this wave. Some scholars characterizes the post-Mutawakkilian religious climate as one of the semi-rationalism, a trend among the scholars who stood midway between the rationalism associated with the Mu'tazila and the strict traditionalism of Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Many of these figures lean towards the Shafi'i jurisprudence and, like Ibn Kullāb, accepted the modest role of the Kalam in articulating and defending creed. So the hallmark of Ibn Kullāb's theology, often termed as the Kullābite formula or al-Qaida al-Kullābiyya, concerned the relationship between the divine essence and the God's attributes or the sifat. Formulated against the backdrop of the Mihna debates on the nature of the Quran, his position held that the divine attributes neither identical to God nor entirely other than Him. La hiya hu wa la hiya ghayruh. And this became a foundational principle for later Ashārite metaphysics. Ibn Kullāb aligned with traditionalists in refusing to interpret Quranic description of God, such as His seeing, speaking, having face, or possessing speech through metaphor, a purely negative theology. While many traditionalists were satisfied with affirming such attributes bila kayf, without explanation, Ibn Kullāb believed their truth could be rationally demonstrated, and to do this, he employed the analytical tools of Basr and Kalam and combined the traditional affirmation with the structured argumentation. Ibn Kullāb's theological reasoning shares the several premises with contemporary Basr thinker such as Abū Muḥammad. Yet, crucial differences set him apart. While Abū Muḥammad understood divine attributes such as God seeing or knowing as temporally specific acts which occurs at a particular moment, Ibn Kullāb viewed this description as pointing to eternal, predeterminate qualities subsisting within the divine essence itself. Following the Basr and Kalam tradition, Ibn Kullāb worked within an occasionalist ontology and assumed a fundamental correspondence between the language and reality, the doctrine known as the Wad' al-Lugha. Through the rational analysis of the Quranic Arabic, one could infer truths about the divine nature. Everything that exists can be described as a thing or shay, including God and His attributes. And ontologically, an existent is either quality, the sifa, or a qualified entity, or the mawsuf. So just as created substances are characterized by the accident that subsists within them, or al-qaim bihi, God's essence is qualified by the attributes that subsist within the divine reality. As accidents are intrinsic to a substance, yet not identical to it, so God's attributes are intrinsic to the divine essence without collapsing to the identity or implying the separateness. Moreover, just as the accident of the created entities do not subsist through one another, the divine attributes are not eternal because of their separate attributes of eternity, but because the divine essence itself is eternal. Beyond the broad outline in Kullābite formula, reconstructing the finer details of Ibn Kullāb's theology is difficult due to the limited surviving sources and evidence. However, one important element is his distinction between the attributes that sifa and description are the wasf. A sifa represents a real determinate quality subsisting in the divine essence, whereas the wasf is merely a report or the khabar that doesn't point to an actual ontological entity. This distinction allowed him to affirm the certain truths about God through independent reasoning, even when not explicitly expressed in the scripture. For example, although the Quran doesn't explicitly describe God using the term existence or the thingness, the shay'iyya, Ibn Kullāb argued that the reason established that God is an existing thing, not due to an attribute of existence, but because the divine essence itself entails existence. Yet the line between what has and has not a scriptural foundation is not always straightforward. One might argue, based on the Quran verse لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ, that there is a textual support for speaking of God in terms of the shay'iyya. His acceptance of God as qadim, pre-eternal, is understandable, but his hesitation to affirm the qadim or the qidam as a real attribute is less clear. And similarly, his reluctance to affirm the attributes such as persistence or the baqa, which could reasonably be grounded in the Quranic verse وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ, or the divinity, the ilahiyya, despite the Quranic frequent use of the term ilah, remains somewhat puzzling. On most theological issues, Ibn Kullāb inclined towards the views of Ahl al-Hadith traditionalists. He affirmed the reality of the Quranic anthropomorphic description of God without resorting to figurative interpretation. He upheld the believer's vision of God in the hereafter, and he regarded God's istiwa on the throne as a real divine attribute. Yet his interpretation of the divine speech of the kalām Allah would have alarmed many strict traditionalists. Ibn Kullāb's approach to divine speech reflects a careful attempt at the doctrinal balance designed to uphold the traditionalist doctrine of the uncreated Quran while avoiding the persecutional attention of the Mihna authorities. He distinguishes between the essential meaning of God's speech, which is eternal, uncreated, and unlike human speech, and its manifest expression within the created world. For Ibn Kullāb, divine speech in its essence is neither sound nor letter, nor does it consist of specific modes such as command, prohibition, or narrative. Humans merely acquire its expression when reciting or hearing the Quran, so one must differentiate between the recitation and the object of recitation, just as one distinguishes between the remembrance and the object remembered. And this distinction mirrors the view of his contemporary al-Hasan ibn Ali al-Karabisi, who argued that the utterance or the lafz of the Quran is created while the underlying divine speech is uncreated. And this aspect of caution, Ibn Kullāb preferred to avoid using the term Quran in technical discussions, and often substituting the phrase God's speech or the kalām to prevent the doctrinal misunderstandings. He made one notable exception with Musa ﷺ, whom Quran explicitly describes as hearing God's speech directly. And another interesting divergence from the typical traditionalist thought concerns Ibn Kullāb's definition of faith or iman, which existed independently of a'mal. His theory of human action was influenced by the Basran theologian al-Najjar, and according to this view, human actions are created by God at the moment they occur, while humans acquire them and so bear the moral responsibility. Ultimately, human choices and moral directions unfold within the framework of the divine favor, or the tawfiq, or the divine abandonment. A person's final destiny, whether as an inhabitant of paradise or hell, is rooted in God's eternal decree, reflecting Ibn Kullāb's broader alignment with the predestinarian tendencies found among the Ahl al-Ithbat. So far, we have explored how he employed the Basr and Kalam techniques to defend the traditionalist position, how he navigated the heated debate surrounding the Quran and Mihna, and how his nuanced formulation on divine speech, divine attributes, and human action become central to the latter theological developments. And even with the scarcity of the surviving text, his influence resonates through the work of the Sunni theologians who viewed him as one of the earliest pioneers of their tradition. So friends, our exploration of the pre-Ashari landscape doesn't end here. In our next episode, we turn two major predecessors of Ashʿarism. Number one, al-Muḥasib, the moral theologian ascetic whose writings shape both Sufism and the early Kalam. And second, al-Kalam, another influential but unstudied figure in the formation of the early Sunni theological identity. We'll examine their contributions, the methods, and their role in shaping the intellectual soils from which Ashʿarism would later emerge.